Welcome to Season 3 of the United by Coffee podcast, where our mission is to unite the world through coffee. I'm Christy Ross.
Hey, I'm Greg Hess.
So Greg, today we are getting into another important aspect of coffee. We're going to talk to a Q grader. They're a skilled professional that understands quality, and they judge coffees sort of on multiple levels.
Got it. So like cupping is a part of that, maybe?
Yes, absolutely. Cupping is an important aspect of grading, but there's actually 20 different exams that Q graders have to pass, which includes everything from general coffee knowledge to sensory skills to identification and olfactory skills, and definitely lots of tasting, which is where cupping comes in.
Well, I am starting to get the feeling again that I didn't study for the late night test before the exam, but I'll try to hang in there.
Well, I'm sure our guest today will be able to tell us anything we need to know and probably give us the cliff notes too. Today, we are talking to an expert in roasting who is an educator, Q grader for CQI, which we'll talk about what that is a little bit later. She's held a very important role in the Coffee Coalition for Racial Equity. She also has her own company, Kandake Boutique Coffees. So a lot to talk about. Welcome, Candice. Thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So why don't we start out and have you tell us a little bit about your background and sort of where you grew up, what you went to school for, all that good stuff.
Sure. I had a very non-coffee related background. So I grew up in London. I'm Gen X, which means I'm fairly feral and raised myself. And that feeds into how I diverged from everything that was set up for me and became a coffee professional. I grew up hothouse, went to very posh public schools, and on the weekends I went to conservatoires because my mother was a musician originally, and I went to drama school, and I had sort of like tutored lessons outside of school, and grew up in a really, really privileged environment, which if you grow up privileged, you don't notice it. And as soon as you're outside of that environment, you're like, oh, wow, okay. So I ended up I decided my school was a feeder school for Oxford and Cambridge, and I was having none of that. I didn't know until a few years ago that I'm autistic and didn't understand that pathway at all. It just didn't feel right to me. But I always knew that I wanted to live in the US. The only way I knew that I could get to the US was to go to college. And so I did a lot of interviews and got into some very illustrious schools. And I remember an interview I had for Brown University. And they said, why do you want to go to school at Brown? And I was like, well, it's about 3,500 kilometers away from my family. So that's a plus. And apparently I was hilarious. But I ended up going to a really gorgeous small school called Vassar that really kind of like had a lot of creative and artistic freedom. But that multidisciplinary education and the life that I led really did set me up for not just the portfolio career that I had before coffee, but for coffee itself.
How did you get into the education side of coffee and then specifically around roasting?
Well, interesting. My entire family are educationalists. My mum was an inspectorate for the UK government for a while. She went through sort of teaching and what have you. My grandmother was a teacher before she became a social worker. My great aunt was a teacher. My aunt is a teacher. My sister is now the assistant principal at my fancy high school that I went to. My brother was a teacher. Like everybody in my family in some regard is an educationalist. So I decided it was never going to happen. I was never going to be in education. I wouldn't want anything to do with it. No. So here we are. I'm a teacher. I think the thing about education is it's a vocation. You can't get away from it. It's something that you are born to do. And you can tell somebody who's an educationalist by vocation versus someone who works as a teacher. They have a very different way of being. So of course, I never wanted to be in education, and my whole life was set up that way, to see and to recognize and to understand that what I learned, I love learning. Like, absolutely adore it. And that's pretty much how I live my life. I live my life to learn. And so getting into coffee was accidental. God, I can't believe I'm about to tell the story. I spent my kind of like late teenage years when my dad got an apartment just off Portobello Road. And Portobello Road was, as you see in the movie Notting Hill, it was very much that golden era of Portobello Road. Like lots of independent stores, lots of people, tons of Hollywood actors. And we didn't care. English people don't care if you're famous. It doesn't matter to us. You just, they were part of our community. And there was a old coffee shop there owned by some famous people whose names are lost in history to me. And I got a job there because I was wearing a camisole, and my boss was like, I need someone to work here and you look great. And I was like, okay, thanks. Yeah, he was like, do you know what a portafilter is? And I was like, sure. He's like, can you steam milk? I'm like, yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
Do that. Never, ever, ever touched anything but a Mr. Coffee before in my life. And I only had that because of, for exams. My mom allowed me to drink coffee for, the really hard, intense English exams that you do in your teens. It was very obvious I didn't know what I was doing. The first time I was steaming milk, I remember this so clearly. He was good, 15, 20 feet away working on some paperwork at the other side of the cafe. And he said, "Candice, that milk is burnt." And I was like, does he have cameras in the milk jug? Like, how does he know what's going on? I was like, "No, it's not. I don't know what you mean. It's fine." He's like, "The milk is too hot. It's burnt. You haven't put enough air in it." And I was like, "How do you know?" And he's like, "Well, I can hear it." And my mind was blown. From that moment, I wanted to know everything about coffee. Like, I was just like, how does this little wizard man know this? Like, what kind of like books has he been reading? Did he have to sell his soul to the coffee devil in order to like learn? Like, how do you know this? And obviously, like, it was magical to me at the time. Now it's less magical and more just to do with chemistry, but it just blew my mind. And his enthusiasm for his craft is what gave me my enthusiasm. And then that was it. I wanted to learn everything. That kind of like constant learning that I was doing. And at that point, like, there were literally only 16 specialty coffee baristas in the UK. Like, I was one of them. Like, it was such a small community that all the London specialty coffee cafe owners would get together every first Thursday of the month to have dinner and just talk about how do we get people to understand that coffee is awesome. I was only in coffee for about, I think, 9 months before I started roasting, because I realized that, I can't do anything to make this coffee taste better, no matter how I extract it, unless the beans are good. And the first stop there is the roaster. And if they haven't been roasted properly, and we didn't know anything about solubility, and there wasn't any TDS meter at the time and what have you, but you knew that it had to be good at that point. And so people joke that I'm going to own a farm, and they better not joke, because that is on the list. Like, as you go back down the supply chain, you realize that you can't actually make coffee any better. And that's something that I teach. If the coffee hasn't been grown correctly, if it hasn't been harvested and processed with quality, you can't roast quality into coffee. You can't brew quality into coffee. You can only do the best with what you have. It was only about 6 months after I started roasting that I passed the Q. I was the 12th Q grader in the UK. There were only 11 people. Yeah. And all of those people were either in the stock exchange or, back in huge import companies. So I didn't know it was a big deal. I think the thing is, if you don't tell me that something is a really big deal, I'm just not going to notice, and I'm just going to do it anyway. The opportunities that were afforded me, and I didn't sort of walk into anything. Like, for all of those kind of like, the event, I guess I don't know what they call it now, the SCAA event, the yearly kind of like conference. I was in the back room most of the time. I would go there for free just because I was a volunteer. I would be brewing coffees, I would be grinding coffee all day, but mostly I'd be marking papers, grading papers, and like making sure that all the educational stuff was, taken care of. And that was my way of giving back. But what I got in return was the opportunities that just fell at my feet, mostly because I was just willing to take them. And so I know that things are different now all over the world, and I don't know the milieu in the UK, but I'm sure it has to be very different because the world has moved on and changed. But the sad part is there was no space for me in the coffee industry in the UK. It wasn't my intention to leave so quickly. I don't hate my birth country, and I really wanted to achieve that. It's just, it wasn't happening. And so I think people thought that if they slammed doors in my face, I wasn't going to open them for myself. So I did. I took myself to Scandinavia. I know a bunch of people all over Scandinavia, because I basically knocked on their doors and demanded that they keep me in their houses and, take me to work. They just welcomed me. And so where I couldn't find a space, I made a space, and people made space for me. And so I am going to be doing a project in the UK with Kandake, my business, very soon. And I'm really glad to start something there, because no matter how I was treated, that's no longer an issue for me. Now I just want to keep giving back and keep showing people that people like me have just as much right to be in an industry that is founded on the labor of Black and brown people in countries that, we talk smack about. Coffee is for everybody. And I want to make sure that, as much as I kind of like huff and puff and sometimes want to walk away and be like, I can't believe this, and, get mired in the politics or the nonsense or whatever, I think it's really important that people like me exist and do things and are visible, because, I get it all the time now. I get, people of color come up to me and be like, I saw you years ago, and people who know my name, I'm like, why do you know my name? It didn't really resonate with me how important my story was until it started to come back to me.
Well, you told us a little bit about you've told us a great amount about your journey and the difference between, the culture of coffee between the US and UK. Is there anything that you could maybe focus on just the consumer? And I know this is getting a little bit more technical, but the differences between markets in terms of coffee professionals and the consumer market for higher end coffee. What have you observed the differences to be in general?
I think this is the truth, that the commonality is how much people on the consuming end want to learn. And what has changed and what's different is now the consumers are educated. We used to have this whole thing in the UK, you have to educate the consumer. And it was kind of a little bit what happened over here in the US. You have a through line in the US. You have a straight landmass from Central America, in Mexico. You have coffee producing lands that are straight and adjoined to you all. We don't have that in the UK, and we have no coffee producing lands close to us that aren't like continents away. And so in that regard, there's a lot more innate knowledge than people realize in the US consuming than there was in the UK.
So I'm gonna quickly sort of shift gears and get to the technical definition of Q grader and what CQI is and what the difference of sort of roasting education versus Q instructing is, and get some sort of I guess I'll call it structure around that for our audience.
Sure. The CQI is the Coffee Quality Institute, and it was started with funds, I believe, under the auspices of the SCA, and became kind of a more separate arm. So things have mutated massively since I first started. When I started in coffee, it was a very kind of like, it was the jewel in the crown of the most accomplished coffee professionals was being a Q grader. So the Coffee Quality Institute is an NGO, and it's there to, its mission is to make the lives of people who grow and produce coffee better. And by doing that, how they do that is to increase the quality of coffee, with the knowledge of the producers as well as professionals in consuming countries. And then a way to do that is to have professional cuppers. So a Q grader is a quality grader. And it is somebody with a very honed, disciplined palate who is as objective as possible. And let's put a big asterisk by that because everything is subjective. But it's to try and take as much of the subjective and subjectivity out of coffee tasting to analyze the coffee for quality. Specialty coffee really just focuses on the top 20% of coffee. So that scale goes from 80 to 100. So coffees that are sort of 80 to 85 are considered okay. They are very good coffees, but we as specialty coffee professionals, we go all the way up, to the 90s. And, I've never scored a coffee at 100, but I have scored a coffee 97, and it's been absolutely worth it. But we work in very small and very narrow kind of bands of quality. And in order to be able to have that type of discernment, you have to have professionals who are very, very, very skilled. So when I started, being a Q grader was a 3-day certification course. There was no education. There was you weren't supposed to know what the tests were. In fact, there was all this, what's the test? It was all this kind of hush thing. And at that point, there were 22 tests. I think it's down to now 20 because they've kind of combined a couple and gotten rid of things that weren't necessary. But this is a test that it was 3 days. You walked in, you cupped some coffee to calibrate to your group. And then you had to start taking tests in aroma. You had to start taking tests in organic acid, taking tests in the quality of roasting samples, because if you can't tell if your coffee has been roasted properly, what are you actually grading? The tests are far and wide. And there's a general knowledge test of which you have to pass, I believe it's 75 to 80%. So it's and still is, a very multidisciplinary, very comprehensive way of being able to assess coffee. Now, it's not just what's in the cup. It's also, you have to be able to grade roasted coffee and green coffee. So it's not just tasting the coffee. You as a coffee professional have to be able to receive in a sample of coffee, be able to grade that green coffee, which is raw coffee, and then either roast it yourself or have it roasted to a very specific standard, which is in the SCA guide. And you have to be able to know that from the taste that it's been roasted correctly. And then you have to be able to assess that coffee visually roasted as well. I had an ace in my back pocket that I didn't know about. I'm a super taster. I didn't know that. So for anyone who doesn't know, the population of everywhere is divided into 3 categories. You're either a non-taster, a regular taster, or a super taster. And it just has to do with the amount of taste buds you have in your mouth. And most super tasters are women. There you go. There's a freebie for the Q.
Wow.
Most super tasters are women because obviously female bodies can give birth, and therefore we have to be able to detect, poisons and things like that. And so we have a much more acuity for taste. And so I didn't realize that I had sort of a little thing that was kind of helping me. And then I remember an instructor saying, that doesn't help if you don't know how to use your brain. And so, yeah, it was kind of both of those things. But these tests were they broke down for me what coffee really was about. They broke down for me what physiology you needed, in your body, how to use. Everyone thinks their tongue is the tool that you use to taste coffee. It's not. It's your brain. Your tongue is just like the floppy disk drive. This is how I'm dating myself. The USB port that you put your USB stick in, but it's the processor of the computer that reads everything, right? It was just phenomenal to me, just the learning experience of that. And so you have to be very closely calibrated with your group. So it also encourages you to talk and be aligned with your fellow coffee professionals. And this camaraderie and this kind of, learning and working together was really inspiring.
How long does it take? If I said, I want to take the Q, right? Like, is it, could I expect that I could go take it in 6 months, or should I have a year preparation? Should I have 5 years under my belt? Like, what would you say in general, right? Not knowing anything about that person.
It's not just the knowledge that you have to have, but it's the practice. So if you're not cupping all the time, if you're not evaluating coffee all the time, if you're not talking to people all the time, it's going to be even harder when they break those down into tests. Like, I will be putting tiny amounts of organic acids into the same coffee, and I'm going to expect you to be able to name that organic acid, and I'm going to expect you to be able to find it on the table. And it's small stuff like that. I'm going to test you on coffees that you're going to say taste completely different. And then when I put them in a triangulation table, you're not going to be able to tell the difference between 3 cups of coffee, because they're going to taste, their characteristics are going to be so similar, and you're going to have to discern between the quality of the acidity, or maybe the only difference that you can find is something on the aftertaste or the retronasal kind of experience. Maybe it's just to do with the mouthfeel. Like, it's incredible acuity that you have to be able to pass these tests. So I don't say it's like, I don't mean as long as possible as a kind of, whatever answer. I really mean that. I mean, people will be in the profession for years before they take this test. When I took my calibration in Switzerland, Ruki and Trish came up to me, because at this point you couldn't just apply to be a Q instructor. There were only 25 or 30 of them in the world at that point. And they came up to me and said, we'd like you to be a Q instructor. And I was like, this is crazy. And if you think it's hard to be a Q grader, being a Q instructor, that is insane. And so just that invitation alone made me feel really proud of myself, and really made me understand that I had, everyone has imposter syndrome, don't they? So even with my license and my newly minted calibration license, I still didn't feel like, I was like, oh my God, this is so whatever. And so becoming a Q instructor for me was just, it was great for my own personal growth, but I was like, now I get to teach this. Now I get to help people. And it felt really good that all of the stuff that had been poured into me, I now got to pour into other people. So that, I think for me, that's like my proudest thing, being able to go around the world. I've taught in the Philippines, and I've taught, here, and I love it. Roasting coffee isn't hard. Roasting coffee is like driving a car, but just not everybody will be Lewis Hamilton. Roasting coffee is like, you learn to drive on your first lesson. They show you the pedals, they show you the gears, you steer it. You're just not a proficient driver until you've practiced and gotten, your own little idiosyncrasies under your belt, and learned the road, and learned what it's like to drive in the rain versus not, and freeways versus small country roads, and things like that. And it's the same with roasting. I can teach you how to roast in 3 hours. It's just mechanics.
So tell us about the process of that discovery, right? And sort of unlocking the potential of a coffee. And then talk about maybe what surprises you the most during that process.
If I can taste that coffee, I can tell you exactly how I want to pull that out. But that's knowing which stage of the roast produces what characteristics. So if I sample roast a coffee, I can taste the flat characteristics of that coffee without anybody's roast kind of signature on it. So I'll know that this coffee has really great fruit notes. This coffee is really acidic, so maybe I want to pull back on that acidity. Already my brain starts working. Okay, so in this part of the roast, I need to do that. In this part of the roast, I need to do this. And then I have my own particular style of roasting. I like really articulate coffees. I don't like homogenized flavors. I will produce those for consumers. But if I'm roasting for myself, and this is what I did early on in my career, and how I managed to do this with the roasting technology of the Loring, which allowed me to roast coffees on a machine that people said, you can't roast espresso on this. Yes, you can. And people would say, you can't have acidic coffees in competition. Yes, you can. It's about learning the kind of little minutiae and differences and characteristics of a particular coffee, and then applying the theory, very straight theory of roasting, of where in the roast to apply heat, where to pull back on heat, what to stretch out, what to not stretch out, learning, the Maillard reaction and when that starts. And so how to kind of eke that out. The Maillard reaction is one that everybody knows. It just sounds fancy. It's a browning reaction. It's a non-enzymatic browning reaction. It's what happens when you put steak on a pan. It browns. It's like toasting bread. It's the same thing with coffee, but there have to be certain conditions in order for that reaction to take place. And then there's different ways to manipulate the roast at the beginning to bring out fruit and acidity. There's ways that Maillard reaction produces sweetness, and caramelization happens, close to that too. And then the end of the roast, how to finish it, when to take the coffee out the roaster is a really big one. So you can have an amazing roast and then you just leave it in there too long, or you take it out too quickly and boom, you've ruined all your good work. So it's learning your machine, learning what you want from the coffee, and understanding how to taste and be able to taste the roast. That's what basically makes you good at your job.
Amongst all your projects,
Mhm.
we also saw that you were working on launching your own coffee project. But launching anything new obviously has its challenges. Tell
Yeah.
us about how you're progressing, maybe
Mhm.
what some of the bigger challenges that you faced, and of course, what you're excited about, which is
Sure.
which is easy to tell from how you talk about coffee.
Oh, I'm excited. Well, the biggest challenge is one that has nothing to do with coffee. And so a few people know about this. I made a little bit of noise on social media when I recognized how much this had impacted me. So I was, last year, I think it was, between March and June, writing business plans with wonderful people. Jay, whose last name I will remember, amazing coffee professional who works for Irving Farm Coffee in New York, was helping me to understand and craft like the technical aspect of that, talking to amazing people at Loring and Cropster and sort of these amazing ideas and putting everything together. And then I slipped and fell 15 feet onto a rock, onto my head.
Oh,
Oh,
And I blacked out. I don't know for how long because it was 4 o'clock in the morning. I'm always up working out, and I was walking down the stairs, some very slippery stairs at my apartment building. And yeah, that has changed the entire course of my life. As a teacher, you have to learn to mask. Even as an autistic person, I don't mask in natural sort of daily life. But as a teacher, you have to engage your students, you have to be communicative, and you have to get things across. And so I didn't realize, but that part of me went into overdrive. For 8 months, I didn't realize I wasn't okay. And when I finally realized, and I don't live with anyone, so nobody was realizing that I was forgetting words, I was slurring words. And the big one is I had amnesia and had no clue. So when I finally sought help in March of this year, my neurologists were just like, how have you been managing? Like, how have you been existing? And I said 2 reasons. I used to have a lot of money, which I now no longer have because I have a head injury and I wasn't able to work the same way. And two, and then the neurologist piped up. He's like, "You're exceedingly bright." And I'm like, "Oh, well, maybe." And so all of my abstract thinking is completely fine. But for a really long time, my executive function and my prioritization and kind of like the basic skills were gone. And because I can talk like this, most people couldn't see the deficits. And so I finally had to put everything on a shelf and just leave it there, which is, as I've been getting better, increasingly frustrating because I've, my packaging design, everything was kind of set up and I was ready to go. Like it literally happened at the point where I was about to launch my company. But what happened is this very hyper independent person had to start asking for help. And I realized how many people I had helped because so many people came out to help me. So with the help of friends in the UK, with the help of friends here, I'm getting ready to launch again, a much more scaled down version at the beginning of what I was originally going to launch. So just to make sure that I'm working within I don't want to I've let go of the operations, but I don't want to let go of being of the visionary and, being the heart of my company, because Kandake means it's a word that is basically means queen. It means it's the only female dynasty in the Nubian Kush Empire. But Kandake is also the word that Candice comes from. The name Candice is a derivation of Kandake. And so it's like honoring my family. Candice is my birth name, but it's not the name that I go by. And so I wanted to make sure that Candice was still part of the coffee industry. And so that's the name that I gave my company. It's a project that I own and want. And so I had designers on board. Everything was getting ready to start. And this year has been incredibly challenging and very humbling. And I needed that. I needed a pause in my life to step back. Everything was going full steam ahead. My career was just going from like this and this and this, but so many other things in my life had been left behind. So many other people in my life had been left behind because I was just marching ahead. And so many other aspects of me as a person were getting buried under, achievements and ambitions.
To have something so traumatic happen, I think you're spot on. It just makes you reflect on, what matters in life and where should your focus lie. And, you still have like an incredible focus on so many different things. You've also been working with like the Coffee Coalition for Racial Equity, right? So a lot of those things you even talked about earlier, translate to just constantly doing good and having an impact and teaching and protecting, if you will, right? Like the children, like child labor. So talk a little bit about that too, because is that something too that has been shelved, or is that something that's ongoing as well?
I remember talking about race and coffee in the UK and being called racist because I pointed out racism. And that was a feature of my childhood and the UK. Like you couldn't talk about race because that made you a racist. Like you couldn't talk about inequality to people who were oppressing you because you made them feel uncomfortable and therefore therefore you're a bad person. And so I didn't learn to shut up. I've never shut up, but I learned where my audience were. And then Phyllis wrote this letter and she was just like, damn you, like, I'm going to talk about this. And I was like, well, hell yeah. Yeah. And Phyllis is an incredible professional, an incredible person, and really does walk the walk that she talks. Like, she gets into the room and she brings everybody along with her. But she'd been doing so much stuff, not alone, but very much spearheading a lot of stuff alone. And when we started talking, she was like, I really want to do something, big. So I invited her onto a podcast recording. It was held, I was working for Royal Coffee, the importers here in the US and China, and they're global, but their main office is in the US. And I was working for them as a director of roasting at the time. But it was the pandemic, so nobody was really doing anything. And we had to pivot to kind of make sure our community stayed together. We hosted a podcast called Specialty Coffee, or Race and Specialty Coffee. I can't remember the exact title, but we had over 1,000 people on that podcast, on that recording. It was insane. I expected like maybe 50 people and all of just our friends to turn up, and 1,000 people turned up. And they listened to us talk about our experiences, what it was really like for us in the industry, an industry that seems to be like, brand names and great coffee, and didn't really talk about, and always the disparity was between the producing countries and the consuming countries. And we were like, no, the disparity is right here. I couldn't get a job for 2 years in the UK. Mm-hmm. I had to my dirty secret was that I was a consultant because I couldn't get a job because nobody would hire me. And these are people, the industry was tiny at the time. People knew me. They just didn't want that. We wanted to talk about the fact that this was something that was hidden and it was kind of like swept under the carpet. And then Phyllis was like, right, we need to, it's been a call to action. So I need to action something. And so she created the CCRE, and she invited me to be a part of that as the kind of vice president. And I served 2 years, and I'm really proud of the work that we did together. They're doing leaps and bounds more work. She gets interviewed on national media now. She gets to, really kind of like fundraise for real money because people recognize and understand that by cutting and excluding people from the coffee industry, you're hurting the coffee industry. You're not really hurting us. We're used to this, but you're hurting the industry that you love so much. And so through Phyllis and with the help of several companies, one of whom was Inter-American, we were able to start what was called the PACE program, which is a program where we placed really great coffee professionals who weren't getting the opportunities that they really deserved and should have been getting into offices and labs where they could actually get the opportunities commensurate with their skill level. And through that, they were able to, there were 3 people, there were lots of candidates, lots of people got interviewed, and 3 people were chosen, and, being able to contribute to that and interview people and meet people, a couple of whom now work for my company, and 2 of them who are took the Q with me and things like that. So we met people who were then able to, pick great candidates. A job interview, it wasn't a gift, they earned what they got, and they were able to work with the company for a year and really learn, some skill sets and have those opportunities that they weren't getting, which they totally deserved, including taking the Q. Yeah, I'll never shut up about race because we have to keep talking. I would love to shut up about race. Believe me, yeah. I would love to talk about coffee. I would love, to not talk about these things. I would love if this was all over. And so if this is a way to make this, to finish this conversation, then it's worth it.
Do you have a tip or a trick that, because I feel like there are so many, even when you're talking about roasting, I thought this was cool, but do you have a tip or a trick for the coffee consumer, either about brewing or grind or coffee selection, just something that you think would pass on a little bit of your expert knowledge that maybe most people don't know about?
Sure. I was thinking about this, and I was thinking you've had some really awesome people on this podcast, and I'm fairly sure they've given you really kind of great little tips and tricks about coffee. So I'm going to give you one that not everyone talks about, or at least doesn't kind of validate or rubber stamp. Drink what you like. Don't let anybody tell you what you do and do not like, what is good and what is not good. I was told for years that natural coffee was terrible and we can't drink natural coffees and ew, they're dirty. Drink what you like. Learn about what you like and do it unashamedly. There is nothing wrong with having your Starbucks. There is nothing wrong because it means that farmers get paid. That's all I care about. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with enjoying your Frappuccino. There's nothing wrong with really loving a delicious single origin pour over. If you limit yourself, all you're doing is limiting your experience in coffee. I think the tip is to know what you like, feel confident in what you like, and enjoy the coffee. If you're selecting beans, the only thing I can say is try to get beans that are roasted as close to when you buy them. I remember having a bag of coffee and being really excited because I had this bag of coffee from a commercial roaster in the UK that I won't mention, that they're nobody that we know, but it's I don't like to malign people, but it's best before date was 2.5 years in the future. And it was 2.5 years because we'd gotten the bag in that first coffee shop that I told you about. We'd gotten that bag in I think a year before.
So this leads me actually with your answer about you not drinking coffee every day. Now I'm totally interested in these next three questions, which we call our U3 top three. So these are very brief answers, Candice, but I'm literally on the edge of my seat to hear what you have to say. Okay, number one is your favorite brewing method.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so this is hilarious. If I could, I would drink cupped coffee every day. Cupping coffee to me is the best way to taste a coffee. The grind size, the temperature of the coffee, and how you're supposed to taste it. The only way, I mean, in fact, we used to do this. We used to get the coffee at the end of a cupping session, put a filter, and then just like pour all the cupping bowls in and drink what was there at the bottom. Cupping coffee, like that really exposes all the flavor and taste of coffee. So the best translation for that for me is a full immersion method. I love a great pour, I love whatever, but a French press, yeah, clever dripper, anything. I even use my AeroPress inverted so I can do a full immersion on the plane.
There you go. Because I was racking my brain right now going, how are we going to show that icon of cupping? We'll just show a cup.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, just a French press well done, as long as you like kind of do the kind of machinations of taking the crust off and making sure that you're not over brewing and what have you. A full immersion coffee is delicious. It's smooth, it's well extracted, it's super easy.
Love
and
it.
You're not having to do this.
Yes. All right, number two for consumption then, coffee drink of choice. I think I know your answer on this. I mean, black or extras like latte, cream, sugar, hot, cold, specific origin or wash.
First of all, no to lattes and milk drinks, mostly because that's what you're paying for. You're paying $7 for a thing of milk and this much coffee. So no. Also, I want to drink coffee when I drink coffee, unless I want to sit and have a brunch. So I would say black. And I don't mind if it's drip, pour over, whatever, but a well-extracted black coffee. Usually single origin. Don't mind a blend. Have nothing against blends, but single origin. It's always going to win is Kenya and Ethiopia for me. You know, a really delicious Kenyan or an Ergashefe or Kachere or something like that from Ethiopia. Like, yeah, I mean.
Love it. Yeah, love it. Well, and so how many cups of coffee do you drink per day? Or maybe you should give it in weeks. Like how many you drink per week? You know?
I'll be honest, like I sometimes have like maybe 3 or 4 coffees a month. I'm sorry.
Really?
I've worked in the industry for so long that like unless it's something I really have to taste. And also really I'm 50. I'm really caffeine sensitive now. So I can only have like 1 coffee if I'm having it and it will last a while. But yeah, I don't drink coffee every day because otherwise I wouldn't enjoy it personally.
Candice, this has been a delight. What an amazing conversation and such a cool story. And we want to make sure that people have the opportunity to share where they can learn more about you or Kandake. Did you say Instagram is the best place? Or
Instagram at the moment, I'm not posting anything. There will be a link to the website there, which is just the holding page right now. But honestly, I've stopped giving out a resume and I just say, put Candice Madison Coffee in Google. And a lot of stuff comes up now. So yeah, it's Instagram will be like the place that I launch things. But yeah, if you want to know a bit more about me, you can look online.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Candice. We appreciate your time and love your story. So thank you.
Thank you, Candice, and thanks to our followers as well. We want to hear from you, so you can always reach out using our email, connect@u3coffee.com, or in the comments with guest recommendations, your own coffee tips and tricks. And of course, we always want to hear what you're drinking. Again, that's connect@u3coffee.com, or head to the letter U, the number 3, coffee.com, where you can learn, connect, and explore the wonderful world of coffee. We'll see you next time.